Wow, can you believe it? We are literally 1 week away from the celebration of the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, more commonly known as Easter Sunday, um, which means today is Palm Sunday. I heard a joke, at least I hope it was a joke, in an Anglican church recently. An individual said that it's amazing that Palm Sunday always comes 1 week before Easter, and I wasn't certain if this person was joking or not, but what it did do for me was demonstrate that there is not as much liturgical knowledge in the church as priests uh, and bishops may often hope for. In other words, uh, Palm Sunday always comes a week before Easter Sunday because Palm Sunday is the triumphal entry, as it is called, of Jesus into Jerusalem before his grisly execution on the cross on Good Friday, and of course, followed by the resurrection on Sunday. And so, again, I don't know if this person was joking or not, but what it did do for me is make me realize the importance of a Palm Sunday, or sometimes as it is called, Passion Sunday sermon. Uh, and by that I mean, in many of our churches, there is no sermon preached on Palm Sunday, Passion Sunday, whichever you prefer to call it. As the gospel reading from this year from the book of Luke is quite poignant, and in all honesty, it does in fact speak for itself. But again, I just feel that this Christus Victor sermon series would not be complete without um, some didactic drawing out, if you will, of what is implicit in our readings on this Sunday of the Passion, also known as Palm Sunday. So, what I want to do is kind of just walk through the readings. And so, we begin with the Liturgy of the Palms, and we read from Luke chapter 19, verses 28 through 40. And as I was preparing the message, I kind of wrote in my notes that this is essentially pre-fight theatrics. As as a church, we have our sort of parade, a little uh, parade around the church, and we carry the palms in this sort of reenactment of what actually takes place in the text. Um, I just find it very comparable to, if you were to watch a wrestling match, or perhaps even a boxing match, but more commonly a wrestling match, where before the two fighters ever step into the ring, there is what I call, like I said, pre-fight theatrics, where there's music, and the fighter may parade around the ring, and hold up his hands, and perhaps spout off a couple of one-liners. And so we see this in wrestling, this sense of pre-fight theatrics, and that's really what's happening in the liturgy today. As we read this procession of the palms, Jesus is preparing for a fight. And not only is he preparing for a fight, but he's actually preparing for a fight on at least two fronts. We could talk about more, but for certain, Jesus is preparing for a fight on two fronts. Again, we have Jesus entering Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is the ring, if you will. This is the place where the fight is going to take place. And so Jerusalem is the ring, and the opponents. We've talked about during our time in Lent. We've talked about how the flesh, the sinful nature itself is an opponent. And so for us as Christians, we are constantly in a battle against our own sinful nature, at least that which remains um, after we have been born again. You know, as we've said in the past, being born again is not a cure-all for what ails us, so to speak, but we must continue to allow the process of sanctification to have its way. And so we talked about the war against the flesh. Now, of course, Jesus won that war hands down, and we've learned that through every temptation that Jesus faced, he came out on top. And so the war, the war, the fight against the flesh, Jesus aced that. And then we have talked about Jesus' war against the regime that held the Jews of his own day captive. So we talked about the political dimension of salvation, where if people are not free legally to worship, then of course they may worship, but then they will also be killed. And so there was a very real sense in which to live as a faithful Jew in Jesus' day was very difficult, because there was literally a practice of emperor worship where people were expected to quite literally idolize the Roman politician, or the Roman patriarch, if you will. There is a real sense in which the government was encroaching upon the civil liberties of the people, and the right to worship the true and living God was to do so was very precarious. Now, having said that, there's another front in which Jesus was fighting, and that is the front of the corrupted priesthood of Jesus' day. So even though emperor worship was something that was expected of everyone, including the Jews, there was still a sense of trying to blend things together, trying to hold in tension the worship of the emperor and the worship of the true and living God. And so where the priesthood came in at is that, and to be fair, often the Roman government is painted as the ultimate villain of Jesus' story. But we do see very clearly in the Gospel of Luke that the Roman government was not alone in the execution of Jesus Christ upon the cross. In fact, we see over and over again in the gospel story as told by Luke that the representatives of the Roman government time and time again tried to release Jesus, tried to wash their hands of the matter, and repeatedly would say that Jesus was a man without fault, and that to crucify him was absurd. And so, but as we know, Jesus is not a person whom we can simply wash our hands of, whether you are Jew or Gentile. Jesus is a person with whom we must interact, with whom we must make a decision. But again, in Luke's recounting of the gospel narrative, we see over and over again that it was not the Roman officials that sought Jesus' death. It was Jesus' own people, Jesus' own flesh and blood, if you will. And one of the ways in which we see that Jesus' own people sought to sabotage what he had set out to do is in this very first reading, Luke chapter 19, verse 38, where we see, and if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it, but we see this appalling reversal of what God actually set out to do. So we see again in Luke chapter 19, verse 38, that the people are crying out for peace in heaven. And in fact, even in the liturgy, we, as the people today, cry out for the same. It says, the priest says, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." And then the people respond, "Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Now, here's what's wrong with that phrase. And again, liturgically, we say it because it's what was said by the people in the text for which we are reenacting this Sunday. But what was supposed to be said? What were the people actually supposed to be saying? Because peace in heaven, it sounds good, but let's, in the same book, in the book of Luke, let's go all the way back from chapter 19 all the way back to chapter 2, in verse 14 to be exact. So Luke chapter 2, verse 14, where the angel announces to Mary what the God-ordained purpose for Jesus Christ coming to his people was. What did the angel proclaim? The angel proclaimed peace on earth. And in fact, we often sing this in many of our Christmas carols, right? Peace on earth and goodwill toward mankind, right? So according to the authorized messenger of God, the angel who came to Mary, the God-ordained purpose for Jesus Christ coming to his people was peace on earth. And yet, fast forward to Luke chapter 19, the people are proclaiming peace in heaven. You see, there is an intentional spiritualization of the gospel of liberation. When God made it very clear that Jesus came to set the people free, that Jesus came to bring peace on earth, you see here in the Lucan gospel that there's already a falling away, if you will, a moving away from the actual God-ordained purposes of Jesus to something that is perhaps more believable, something that is perhaps more in line with the status quo. You see, because if Jesus came to bring peace in heaven, then, you know, that's ethereal, that's esoteric, that's something that we can say and the Roman officials will not be afraid of us. That's something that we can say and we don't have to change the way that we do things. But if we say that Jesus came to bring peace on earth, that means some things have to change. That means we need to do things differently. That means that we cannot sit back and watch a world burn in the fires of sin and shame. That means that we do not simply wait for the Messiah to fix everything, but that we are called by that Messiah to rally and to hope for change. And so you see, there's the song of the people and there's a song of the angels. There's the message of man and there's the message of God. We have to decide which one we're going to heed. We have to decide which side we're on. We also see in our Lucan passage that being Messiah was synonymous with being king. And so, as I said before, there is a political dimension to salvation. As the people were hoping for a Messiah, they ultimately were hoping for a political figure that would deliver them. But we see already they have begun to lose hope in such a figure. Yes, they've seen the miracles that Jesus performed. Yes, they've seen the blind given sight, the sick being healed, the dead being raised. And yet, already in this passage, we see they've given up on the idea of peace on earth. And now they've watered down the message to a message of peace in heaven. And so then we fast forward to Luke chapter 19, verse 40, where we have the Pharisees telling Jesus essentially to stop this peaceful demonstration. And we often, especially us black preachers, we often love to comment on Jesus's following statement where he says, if these don't praise, the rocks will cry out. And that sounds nice and good and flowery, but plainly, if you stick to the context, what Jesus is saying is that there is no stopping this demonstration, this peaceful demonstration, because it doesn't matter if you stop this one, there'll just be another one. Wherever there is injustice, there is no peace. No justice, no peace. There is no stopping this. That's what Jesus was saying when he said, if these don't praise, the rocks will cry out. In the assigned psalm that is read alongside, or rather in procession, at the conclusion of the Liturgy of the Palms, is Psalm 118. Depending on your lectionary, for certain we all will read verses 19 through 29, and some of us will read the first two verses of Psalm 118. And it is interesting to note what is omitted in the liturgical reading of this psalm, and that is the verses where the psalmist speaks of the enemy being cut off, which of course is a biblical phrase for execution, for being killed in the line of duty, killed in battle. And so we see that the church, in imitation of her Lord Jesus Christ, omits the option of armed resistance. And so again, we have this peaceful demonstration which Jesus says there is no stopping what is about to happen. There is no stopping what is to come. So that's really what the procession of the palms, or the liturgy of the palms, and Palm Sunday is all about. We have really spiritualized it and kind of sanitized it from what's going on. But these are the things that undergird the procession of the palms. Jesus is in fact rallying for peace on earth, and he is actually opposed not only by the Roman officials, but more accurately or at least as um, potently, Jesus is being opposed by his own people. Jesus is being opposed by the religious leaders of his own ethnicity. But one thing that Jesus makes clear is that armed resistance is not an option. And so that is the Liturgy of the Palms. We move now to the Liturgy of the Passion. And I love the symbolism that is evident in Isaiah chapter 50, which ultimately is prophetic of what is to come in the life of Jesus Christ. In verse 7, again, Isaiah chapter 50, verse 7, it talks about setting one's face like flint. And that's what Jesus had done during the time that led up until now. Jesus had set his face like flint to make it to Jerusalem. And now, today, he's made it to Jerusalem. And he is there for a purpose. For the freedom of his people, and to confront the religious leaders that have colluded with their oppressors. In Psalm chapter 31, verses 9 through 16, again, we see more of the same, where Jesus has determined to move forward, to march forward. And of course, the psalmist is not speaking directly of Jesus, but we understand that prophetically the psalmist had Jesus in mind, according to the Christian reading of the Psalms. And so, before, of course, the Passion narrative from Luke chapter 23, we make a pit stop through Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. And so last week we talked about how we are to recognize the surpassing value of Christ. But what I love about this week is that we see how Jesus places a surpassing value on us. Jesus was willing to endure the cross because of the surpassing value that he placed on us. And so, of course, we conclude with the Passion narrative, and I won't read it to you again. But what I do want to point out is that in all of this, in all of our gratitude for Jesus being willing to die for us, to fight for us, to stand against the religious leaders, both of his day and of our own day, that have colluded with our oppressors. I want you to step back for a moment from focusing on the divinity of Jesus, and let us focus on his humanity. For yes, he was God in the flesh. Yes, he was the Son of God, but he was yet a man. And we get so caught up looking at Jesus' willingness to die for us that we forget all the anguish that he must have endured, all the mental suffering, just the thought of what he was about to endure. So what the Passion narrative tells us, or rather what it shows us, is that by his words, and most of all by his actions, Jesus showed us that God the Father, his Father, was and still is worthy of our trust. See, Jesus taught us to do what is right And as my mother would say, trust God with the outcome. Jesus said, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. You know, I really believe, knowing that Jesus was as adept in the Torah as he was, adept in the Hebrew Bible as he was, I believe that Jesus had several stories in mind, and I think that one of them just might have been the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The three Hebrews who refused to worship idols, who refused to live the way of the world. God delivered them. I believe that Jesus had Daniel in mind, the young man who refused to be like the others, the young man who went to the lion's den because he would rather die than to be disloyal to his Lord, the God of Israel. And I believe that Jesus knew and hoped that God, his Father, would deliver him from the death that surely awaited at the end of his final confrontation with darkness, with evil, and with the religious leaders who were colluding with the oppressors of his people. And I believe that although Jesus knew that God could and would deliver him from their hands, even if being faithful meant his death, Jesus believed that his Father was good, and that somehow he would be vindicated. If God had to raise him from the dead, if God had to take his bones and his sinews and sew them back together, Jesus believed and knew that his Father was good. And so, my sisters and brothers, that is the message of Palm Sunday. That we are to march alongside our Lord to fight against evil and wickedness and darkness, both in ourselves, in our world, and even in our church. When our religious leaders collude with our oppressors, Christ calls us to take a stand, to be prepared to die. Not because we want to, but if we have to. And the reason why Jesus could march on, the reason why you and I can march on, is best summed up in the Psalm reading, the very first verse of it, which says, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is